I was a student at an elementary school in Wisconsin, which was an elementary school in the country. Well, it used to be the country. It had become the suburbs over a period of several years. And when my family had moved out to this particular area, it was all country, farm field, farm field, farm field. My dad was not a farmer. He grew up on a farm. His dad was a farmer, my grandfather, but he didn't choose to get into agriculture, but he wanted to live out in that environment. So we lived between a couple of farm fields. And for a long time, that's all it was out where I lived. But as I got older, the suburbs sprawled out that way, and all of these new developments were built, all these new houses, all of these new people moved in, and it became a very affluent area. So the school I went to, which at one point was a very country school, became a very affluent school. And my family, where we had moved, and when we had moved, we were not an affluent family. We actually were very much lower on the socioeconomic ladder, and I was far below my peers in the school. And as I went to that school, I realized how low on the socioeconomic ladder I was. I was probably one of the lowest people there. And I would know it every time that winter would roll around, everybody would come in their brand new starter jackets were a thing with your favorite team on them. But I had the old hand-me-down jacket we got from Goodwill or St. Vincent de Paul. That's what I was going to school in. And I never really thought anything of it until other people started to let me know that I was different. My friends, at least people who said they were my friends and other classmates, all kind of pushed me to the side. Well, you're not one of us. You don't wear the same clothes. Your family doesn't live in the same house. You don't drive the same kind of car as my parents do. And it wasn't long before I was isolated and pushed out to the side. And that's a lonely place to be. Elementary school, middle school, those are tough times as you're growing up. You don't understand everything. You don't understand people dynamics. And I remember having a moment where I was completely alone at school. I had no friends. People didn't want to talk to me. The kids at my table, we sat at group cluster tables. They all put up their folders every day when we would get into school so that they wouldn't have to look at me. That's what they said. They said, well, our folders are up because we don't want to look at you during the day. And so I'd sit for 8 hours at a table with people who didn't want to look at me. That's tough. And I would try to kind of sneak into the group, the group of all the popular kids, all the friends at recess, and they would kind of push me out. And then this one day, I started to talk with this guy named Steve, who was a really nice guy. And one of the other guys in the group was like, dude, you get out of here. What are you doing? And Steve looked at him and went, Joel's my friend. I want him to stay. And it's such a trivial, trite little moment, but it's burned in my memory because it was the first time that somebody stepped in and risked their position for me. Because the response to Steve from this kid was, well, then go be his friend then and leave. So he put him, and again, this is in third grade. I remember that. And I was like, wow, somebody cared enough for me to do something they didn't have to do to stand up for me and defend me because I didn't belong. I was other. You have moments like that get burned into your mind. There's another moment that's burned into my mind that happened a few years ago. I was in St. Louis near Ferguson, and there was a lot of social unrest there. And a lot of big questions and conversations were happening. Important conversations and questions were being raised. And I was going to dinner later. We were at a conference like this, and I was walking to dinner with one of my friends from the conference. And it was 9:30 at night. We were going to go get some food. And as we're walking along the street, and there's no cars on it. Nothing's around. And so I just go to cross the street. And my friend, who's a young black man, goes, I can't. I'm going to go up to the crosswalk. I was like, why, man? It's just, he goes, no, I'm not going to jaywalk. Again, you have moments that sometimes switch your perspective. And suddenly I had this perception of what his experience was like at that moment in America's history, in that place, at that time. And everything that had built to it. And something that was already there, suddenly became very clear to me. That for me, a young white man, walking across that street, jaywalking, which is illegal. It's a misdemeanor. It's illegal. I didn't think anything of that. But for him, he's thinking, what are the consequences of that action? Who might see it? And in this current environment, even worse, what might that mean? And I think I'm just going to go forward. To me, to not have to think about those things, that's a privilege. Think about where you're at in your life. We all bring unique perspectives and experiences here. And I think all of us probably bring an experience where in some way we have felt like the other. We felt outside, we felt marginalized, we felt like we didn't belong. And maybe other people have made us to feel that way, or maybe there's certain structures or systems that have made us feel that way. And then there's also the flip side where we've maybe done that to other people, where we've pushed other people out and said, well, you're other, you're different, you're not one of us. One of the realities we confront as human people is that every single one of us in this room has some sort of bias that exists in our life. Every human being has it. It's probably part of even how we've developed as a culture and as a people. We look for people that are like us. It's called like me bias. And so when we start to share experiences, we build up a rapport. Oh, you went to the same school I did? You live in the same place I do? We immediately have an affinity for people like us because we want to form groups. It's part of human nature. The distortion of that is that in forming groups, we also label not like us. Well, that's not like me. You go to a different school. You live in a different town. You look different. You sound different. You have different beliefs and different ideologies. You are other. And recognizing differences is important because that can breed conversations, but sometimes differences are a way that we put up walls. And this can be particularly challenging for a church that Jesus desires to be united. In our world, we face lots of places where there's division. We face lots of places where that division causes the destruction of life or a disrespect for the dignity of human life. And we know some of it is sexism, racism, poverty, socioeconomic discrimination. The injustice is perpetuated against the unborn. We live in a world that's divided, and sometimes in dividing, we seek to dehumanize other people. When you say that somebody's other, putting up the walls, that's just the first step. But sometimes once those walls go up, we don't know what's on the other side, and that breeds fear. And fear can breed anger, and fear can breed contempt, and then condemnation. As a group of people and as Christians, as Catholics, there's a response, though, to this reality, this fractured reality we live in. You and I are part of a family of God. We're part of this big extended family where we have a kinship with every human being that has ever been born and every human being on the planet right now. Because every single person in this room and outside of this room is created in the image and likeness of God with inherent dignity and tremendous worth, profound value. Consider this. Every single person in this room reveals something unique about who God is that no other person will ever be able to reveal. You say something about God that I cannot. You reveal some unique attribute of who God is that I will not. That's profound. But sometimes in our world, we struggle to see the image and likeness of God in other people. This is an absolute core teaching of the church. And this diversity even of people and places and cultures is reflected and enshrined in a vision of heaven that occurs at the very end of Scripture. There's this book called Revelation where this man named John has this vision of heavenly worship. And this is what he sees around the throne room of God. A great multitude which no man could number from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits upon the throne and to the Lamb." All of these people united in worship. But did you catch the piece of diversity here? From every nation, from all tribes and peoples and tongues. So when these people are brought into heaven, they don't all suddenly become like uniform cookie cutter people in white robes with angel wings. You don't become an angel when you die, period, just FYI. They retain the unique identity that God gave them on earth that reflects something about who God is. The disciples at Pentecost, when they went out to preach, everybody heard them in their own language. Again, the diversity that God speaks into our existence because God is much bigger than the places and the boxes we put on him. So this is the first key as we think about a Christian worldview and how it might help heal these divisions. You must have this, and this becomes important for where we're going to go in just a minute. The Catholic Church teaches and upholds this truth, that every human being, from the moment of conception until the moment that they die, has inherent dignity and worth as a human being. And that dignity and worth must be upheld, protected, and valued. And that's a full stop at the end of that sentence. We are also, furthermore, here's the second point, connected. Because God has created each of us. We share something in common, a common origin and a common creator. And furthermore, as people who are Christians, we share a common baptism, which has strengthened this unity and turned us into a family. St. Paul talks a little bit about this in a letter to the Corinthians, where he talks about the church and the body as one, as a body of Christ. And as he's talking about it, he makes this note, that if one part of this body, this family that we're a part of suffers, all suffer together. And if one member is honored, all are honored together. Again, take these words to heart and then recognize what this means. It means that when a part of our human race, a part of our family, our human family that God created, that God knows, that God loves, that God calls their name as well, is hurting and suffering, we in some way hurt and suffer as well. That when I am reading the news and I see something terrible happening to a group of people, then my heart breaks for that. That when I read about genocide happening on the continent of Africa, I hurt for that. That when I read stories about children being harmed in a school, my heart breaks for that. That when I have an instance where a group of people is being marginalized or oppressed or suffering discrimination, I don't feel good about that. I feel icky about that. And at no point do I say, well, that's not my problem. In fact, that statement, that's not my problem, itself has been a problem since the beginning of humanity. Last night I talked about this book, Genesis, which talks about our origins. And there's this family that started, right? This group of people, Adam and Eve, but they have children. Cain, Abel, their two of their sons. And Cain and Abel both bring offerings to God. But there's some jealousy here. Cain's jealous of how God approved of Abel's offering. And it has nothing to do with Abel, but the disposition of Cain's heart, who didn't bring the best offering of what he could give to God. He shortchanged it. But rather than recognizing his fault and his error, he gets angry at Abel and he kills him. God sees this and comes and approaches and finds Cain and calls out to him and says, "Where is your brother?" To which Cain responds, "Am I my brother's keeper? Is it my job to take care of him, to know his coming and his going, to know where he's at? That's not my responsibility." God then responds, "Your brother's blood calls out to me from the ground." As Christians, the character of our church was born in adversity, born as a marginalized and oppressed group of people in Rome, born hated by the government, born thrown out of the synagogues from which it began. And yet this group of people loved and cared for the other, for those who were marginalized, the sick, the dying, the sinner, the tax collector, the people who Jesus loved. This group of people went out beyond the walls. And because of that, it grew. It was a group of people who said the blood of Christ cries out and compels us to love our brothers and our sisters. Here is where the challenge for us lies. Does your heart break for members of the family of God? Do you suffer with those who suffer? Because that teaching, here's where it starts to get challenging. Because it breaks the boundaries of political spheres and news cycles and affiliations with a particular party. Because there's some really difficult aspects to it. Life is sacred, and every human person is made in the image and likeness of God and has immense human dignity and worth from the moment of conception until natural death. And that means an unborn child. It also means a convicted murderer. It means the people who look like me and talk like me and agree with me, the people who are inside of the church and the people who are outside. It means my enemy. And it also needs to convict my heart to say, in what places have I not allowed the blood of my brother, the blood of my sister to cry out to me and to spur me not only to compassion, but to justice? These are tough teachings. Hear me. Because oftentimes we argue about things in our world from a political mindset. Christianity is not political. Catholicism is not political. We speak into the political realm, but we're not beholden to a political party line. In fact, if we do our ministry well and we act right, we will convict perhaps both parties, any party. It's hard when somebody looks at me and says, so you believe that it's wrong, that abortion is wrong. It's the taking of a human life. I do. Well, why? That's impacting a person's choice. Get down to the core issue. If that's a life, if I believe that that's a life, if you believe that life is sacred from the moment of conception, then it's not about choice. That's the next level of the argument. But in our church's teaching, this is the belief. Okay? So you also believe that a serial killer, a murderer, shouldn't be executed? I agree with what the church teaches in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That if there are the proper means to contain that person, so they will do no harm to another person, then no, they should not be executed. And that's the stuff that starts to make us feel weird. Have a choice, but retribution. We're called to a different love. We're called to a love of the family of God that respects the dignity and life of all people. I'm going to challenge you with a couple pieces here of how we can practically do this. Then I want to take a few questions. There are three things I think you can do to love more fully the family of God and have a broad pro-life mindset. Curiosity, compassion, and courage. And Christ exemplifies these things. Here's the first one, curiosity. Sometimes we hear things and we don't want to ask questions. We want to stay rooted in a place that's safe in our political worldview or in our preconceived notions. Get curious and ask questions. I've encountered several people and we've had really good conversations where by the grace of God they've been open and I've been able to be open and be able to discussions. Let's say, racism's not a thing. But I've sat and had conversations with people who've experienced it. And then I ask questions, well, are their experiences isolated? And you dig out deeper and you see that maybe there are things that exist in our world that are unjust. Systems that are in place that are repressed, that hold people back. And then I have to ask myself a question. What am I doing to combat those things? Or how am I feeding into them? Even by turning a blind eye and saying, well, that's not my problem. Curiosity asks questions because maybe you're somebody who's like, I'm really struggling because I don't think abortion's right. But I just don't feel good about telling a woman she can't choose what to do with her body. Because I also value freedom and choice, and that's important too, right? And there's a real tension there. I get that. That's where I have to get curious and ask, okay, well, what does the church teach about this? And how can I wrestle from that point of the church's teaching to understand? You see, our world's not good at this because it's not safe to be curious. What happens is we're like, ooh, that might upset what I believe. So I don't want to ask those questions. I want to go into my echo chamber on my preferred social media platform and read the opinions of a bunch of people who think just like me, and then I'll wonder why everybody else in the world is so crazy. Get curious. Jesus was curious. He had this encounter with this woman who was a Gentile. And in this encounter, this woman comes to Jesus and she says, please heal my children. And Jesus has this really unique encounter with her because Jesus is like, it's not good to take the food of the children of Israel and give it to the dogs. And when you read it, you're like, whoa, Jesus, did you just call this woman a dog? And when you read the text, that is what happens. And then the woman responds quickly and she says, even the dogs eat the scraps from the table. And Jesus says, you have great faith. The child is healed. Weird situation, right? Here's what's going on. Jesus reads the minds and hearts of people. And Jesus wants his disciples to be curious because this woman is a Gentile. She is not of the house of Israel. She's not one of the people to whom Jesus, they believe, has been sent. And she comes asking for a miracle. And the disciples are like, she's other. She doesn't belong. Jesus. And so Jesus says what's on their minds. Well, it's not right to take food from the children and give it to the dogs. And you can imagine the disciples around being like, yeah, tell her. This is our time. This is our rabbi. This is our healer. Go find your own pagan god. Tell her, Jesus. And we do that sometimes, right? Who agrees with me? Who can I amplify? Rather than asking questions. But he wants the disciples to be curious. And this woman, by grace, is able to make them curious by responding in faith. Not being deterred, not running away and saying, you know what? You're going to call me a dog? Even dogs eat from the table. And that's exactly what Jesus wanted her to do. Because now he can come and kind of put the smack down on the disciples and be like, oh, did you see that? Did you see her faith that even when she was rejected, even when she got an answer she didn't like, she still persisted? That's great faith. Get curious. Get compassionate. When one part suffers, we all suffer. To be compassionate, we talked about this in the men's session, is to suffer alongside people, to suffer with them. Jesus does this most perfectly in the cross. He becomes incarnate, takes on human flesh, and when Jesus dies, it is a real death. He really suffers. So Jesus knows what it means to suffer in our world. Do we know what it means to suffer along other people? This means not turning a blind eye to the realities of suffering in our world. We can have discussions about this all day. I'll speak from my experience, and you can take it for what it is. As I've processed and worked through the reality of racism, as people who I know and care about have experienced it, I can tell you a couple of things about my experience. I don't have to have conversations with my kids about the color of their skin at a young age and how that might impact how people treat them. I have not ever thought about what I might have to do to discuss an interaction with law enforcement with my young son. And that's not an indictment on law enforcement. There are wonderful men and women in law enforcement. What I'm saying is that I've had conversations with families across the board and from all walks of life. I know that that's not a conversation I've had to have, and that's a conversation they have had to have. I know that there are places that I get into where I'm just not questioned or asked anything weird or followed around a store. If I walk into a gas station at 11 o'clock at night, I'm walking freely around that gas station. I have a friend who is a black Catholic priest who gets followed in gas stations in his hometown. Those are things that when I see them and I experience them, I'm like, wait a second. Something about that feels off. And here's the last piece. I can ignore all of that entirely. I don't have to pay attention to it at all because that keeps me comfortable. But if I turn and look at it, now I'm suffering with. And compassion, as the guys remember, requires me also to do justice, to fight to make things right. And here's the last piece, is courage. Are you willing to be courageous in entering into the defense of all life, the vulnerable, the marginalized, those who are discriminated against? I shared this with the guys as well. The reality around abortion in our country has changed. The Dobbs decision has pushed the decision for what happens with abortion back to the states. So again, as you're going to hear different things in the rhetoric surrounding this, that Dobbs decision did not outlaw abortion federally. States have the right to choose that. And there will be some states, as there have been, who have said that is not a procedure, that is not something that we will do in this state. It is illegal. And you will have other states swing the other way who will say that is legal up until 40 weeks. Or 40 weeks. You can do that up until birth. And there's going to be questions about all of the politics surrounding this. But remember, as Catholics, the teaching comes down to consistency, which is that all life has sacred, inherent dignity and worth. And if that's what we believe to be true, then the challenge we have is how are we courageously enter into conversations to support and defend that life? That are sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes tricky. But if we believe that, then we have a call to defend it, because when one part suffers, all parts suffer. And when we do this in our world, when we live these things, curiosity, compassion, and courage, we become images of Christ, and we become more deeply rooted in the family of God, which is a profound, profound thing. I want to bring Noelle up on stage so we can answer a few of your questions. You can continue to submit them through the app, but I think it's great to be able to answer a few of these things, and give it up for Noelle. And she's going to help me answer some of these questions because I've talked to you for a little bit. Continue to submit them through the app, and I'm not going to be able to answer them all with Noelle, but we're going to do our very best here. You ready to go?
Ready to go.
Fantastic. What's your favorite ice cream?
Cherry Garcia.
That wasn't in the app, but I thought I'd give you a softball to start off. You did great.
Thank you. I was thinking I did.
All right, here's the first one. And we kind of ended talking a little bit about defending life and abortion specifically. We've talked about a lot of things in this session that are a little bit heavier. But this is a great question, actually. Is it possible to be pro-choice but anti-abortion? In the sense that you support a woman's right to choose between that God gave us free will, but also to be against the act of abortion itself. It's a pretty nuanced question. I think it's a really great question. Again, kind of leaning to that tension. Whoever submitted that, or if that's a question you have, really stellar question. What's your response to that?
Right. So I used to work in pro-life work, a lot of pro-life work, helping work with women, putting on retreats for women who had had abortions. And the simple question is, no, we can't be pro-choice and pro-life at the same time. It's almost like, but it's a safe place, right? Like, I want to support this woman, and let's support her, not, let's support her and her baby, not her or her baby. I have seen women develop mental health issues, eating disorders, all sorts of horrible, horrible things. And pro-choice, because it's been marketed so well, and it's a very safe position for us to take morally, like, yeah, I support her choice. The decision is on her. I would never make this choice, but it's her decision. It puts her in an isolated place. It is all you. You're pro-choice because you can either choose to have your baby or you can choose to finish college. You can choose to have your baby or you can stay in this relationship. You can choose to have your baby or you can be out on the streets. That's not the choice that she needs. That's not the support that she needs. She needs you to be pro-woman. Let me have compassion and walk with you on this difficult path.
I think that's really well said. I think there's a follow-up question here too that's just, and I want to highlight because it came in the first question, like, when we say, hey, it is wrong to have an abortion, isn't that a denial? Or like even legislating some of these things, isn't that a denial of somebody's free will? And I think, again, we'll go back to first principles. So this is actually a very useful thing. Let's step out of this entire conversation for a second about some of these issues. If you want to be an intelligent person, which I know all of you do, adopt the mindset of what is the first principle here. And a first principle is what is the foundational first premise of the argument that I've got to go back to. And here, for the Catholic Church's teaching on so many things, is respect for life, that all life is created with equal dignity and with dignity, worth, profoundly irreplaceable from conception to death. And so leaning into that, we then can get some of the teachings that come through. We say, well, that's true. So when we say that, it's not, well, this isn't a denial of free will. We all have free will. At the same time, one can say that a government has to act in the best interest of people to protect their rights and to protect life. And so as Catholics, we would advocate for things that reduce or eliminate the ability for people to do things that would be harmful. This would be akin to slavery. At one point, slavery was legal, fought for, and protected as a law, but we decided and realized this is dehumanizing and the wrong thing. And so we legislated against it. But there were numerous people who were like, you can't do that. That's a basic right I have to own a slave. Isn't this denying my free will to be able to do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, and even just to see, the church will always stand with the most vulnerable. The church will always define personhood as at the beginning of conception, because any other point after that is arbitrary. It's subjective. It's always powerful versus powerless. You have dignity regardless of your circumstances, how you were conceived. That doesn't define, we talk about cases of rape and incest, how you were conceived. Actually, Sister Miriam in her book, Loved as I Am, has this beautiful thing where she talks about her own wrestling with her circumstances, how she was brought into this world. And she says, God can choose to bless the act of biology that he has created. I know people who were conceived in rape. Their value is not removed based on how they were brought into this world. The church will always stand with the vulnerable and the defenseless.
Yeah, I think that you hit on something, and there's a couple questions about that too. And just to note, Peter Kreeft is a theologian, and let's take one step back off the abortion piece. We talk about abortion in cases of rape and incest. What Peter Kreeft says about rape as a sin is that it is on par and the same as murder. That the severity of that act is, and in some cases, worse than murder. And that is absolutely 100% true. And it's something that's horrific. And that's one of those difficult situations that as Catholics say, wow, that is a hard place. And when we talk about being pro-life, that's where we go back to that first principle to say this is a horrific thing, a terrible thing. But if we hold to that principle of life, how do we act now in supporting the victim of that horrific crime, supporting the life there, and providing both with what they will need to grow, to heal. And those are challenging places. And as Christians, we're called into the challenging places and the places of tension that exist like that. Because love can exist in those tensions.
Yeah. And abortion is marketed as our insurance, right? This is my insurance against being raped. Instead of our culture dealing with the issue of rape, to just say, oh, well, if you get pregnant, you can have an abortion. That's not the only care she needs. We don't need abortion as our insurance. We need you to deal with rape.
Yeah. I think there's so many good questions here, so I'm like kind of going through them. I want to switch up a little bit. And how do you talk to somebody about these things? There's actually been a couple questions about like, how do I talk to my friend about, I think some of these issues, abortion's one of them. I think there's a lot of issues though that the church teaches about, about human sexuality, about how we engage and love people in poverty. Like, how do I talk to people who disagree with that? And how do we have like a civil conversation? Because I think that it's challenging, right? What's your experience with that? What advice would you offer?
Yeah, so I like to ask questions. I want to get to an understanding of where we disagree. Because sometimes when you start asking questions, you'll find you do have a lot of common ground. Like, well, why do you think a woman may feel the need to have an abortion? Well, because she's scared, and I want to support her in that way. Well, I want to support her too, so sometimes just by asking questions. Sometimes though, I think if you're enjoying the intellectual debate and you're having good questions, that's great. But sometimes if it's something that somebody's really wrestling with in their own life, to come at them with a well-formed argument is not always the best approach. Sometimes it's like, this seems like this is something that's really hard for you right now. How can I be here for you? How can I pray? How can I listen? So using kind of our discernment in that situation is important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things I ask people to do as they're having these discussions is to go beyond beliefs. And it's going to sound kind of weird to say this in a religious context, but like follow me here. Beliefs and go to values, because all of our beliefs are underpinned by values. So I heard this guy named Adam Grant explain it this way. Let's say you and I are lobotomists in the 1920s. A lobotomy is a procedure where they remove part of your brain. And for a long time, people thought that was a good way to remedy a lot of different things. Spoiler alert, it's not. It's horrible. But for a period of time, it was like, yeah, that's what you do. Now, let's say that our belief is lobotomies are the best way to treat this particular, like a particular illness, seizures, epilepsy. That would have been one of the treatments for it. If that's our belief and we hold to that, when new information comes along, we can't process it. Hey, new research says lobotomies aren't actually the best way to treat epilepsy. We're going to be like, that's not true, because my belief is that it is. But if my value underneath that is do no harm and do what's right for the patient, and I get to that, I'm like, well, wait a second, maybe I need to reevaluate that belief. This is where you'll find common ground with people who aren't Christian or Catholic. And there's some good questions in there. How do I have conversations like this that doesn't use Christianity as the root? This is how. Okay, well, what do you value? Well, I value freedom. I value choice. I value free will. I value those things too. Oh, good. Now we've got some common ground. But now we can start to get back to those first principles. Well, let's talk then about what the issue really is at hand here, and the purpose of life, the purpose of sexuality, the reality of the church, the purpose of wealth. Any of these bigger issues, I think, are important to be able to touch on. But values, go to a person's values, and you'll be able to have a much more fruitful conversation. Can you talk a little bit about? We're having so much fun with these questions. I'm like, and you keep sending them in. And every time you do, it bumps my app back up to the top. And then I lose where my question is. Okay, how do you deal with people from your church making you feel other?
Ooh, that's a good one. Actually, so this true story, my husband's youth group went to a Steubenville conference. The day they all came home, a girl texted the entire group and said that she had the worst time, that everybody made her feel unwelcome and unloved. My husband called her mom and said, "Can I please talk to her?" She put her on the phone, and they found out all the reasons why she felt isolated. It was because kids were being mean, kids were making fun of kids on social media, and all of these things. And he said to her, "What kind of youth group do you want to have? What kind of church do you want to have?" And she said, "I want this to be a place where everybody's welcome and everybody's loved." And he said, "Okay, I need you to help make it that way." So if you are the one who's feeling other, you can take that concern to your youth leader, to your church, but then you be the person that's bringing other people in. We talked about women and the capacity for another person. You be the person that makes others feel loved and welcomed.
Yeah, I think I would kind of dig deeper, like what about your group is making you feel other, and I think that there's lots of things that can do that. And to ask those questions, but also to recognize that our experience of the humanity of the church is not the church itself. And so that's another piece I would toss out just for prayer, is that sometimes we can say, wow, I feel excluded or marginalized because of the sin of human people, which is very real. But to remember that is not a reflection of the church and the bigger church, which welcomes and brings all people in. I think I want to go with one more question before we move. This is a good one, I think, and this is a good pastoral one. Would I go to hell for having an abortion after I went to confession?
Oh, after you went to confession? No. God can forgive any sin. There's no sin that's too great to be forgiven. There's opportunities for healing retreats. Like, God is constantly reaching out and saying, "Give this to me." I could tell you thousands of stories of women who have found healing in Jesus and mercy, who have had dreams of their babies, meeting their babies. I mean, powerful, beautiful things. So yeah, if you have had an abortion, go to confession. Jesus is waiting and he's ready to heal and to forgive.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of things. I appreciate that. I have nothing to add to that. It's a beautiful answer. One other question I wanted to just kind of toss out at the end is somebody said, well, what if I kind of wrestle with these things with the church's teaching and I decide I don't agree with that? And I understand that as we're going to go through, I have been through moments in my life, and maybe you would say the same, where like there have been things I've struggled with in the church's teaching. I'm like, I just don't know that I agree on that. And I will say this, leaning into the church's teaching is not an afternoon of Googling things and reading a couple of articles. This is the challenge. And the great gift we have as Catholics is when I talk about church teaching, I'm talking about almost 2,000 years of scripture, tradition, and some of the greatest minds writing about a lot of these same topics and needing to dig in a little bit. It's a journey, and it's a good one to take. When you do that, I'd encourage you to do that and to wrestle from a place of openness. I have no doubt there are people here, and maybe you're feeling like you're wrestling a little bit now. You're like, man, some of the things we talked about, I just don't agree. I'm struggling with that. Lean into that and know that you're not a bad person for struggling with that or wrestling with that. But I do need you to wrestle with it. I need you to ask those questions and to be curious and to take your time with it, to recognize that there is great information and great scholarly research and great theological reflection on all these things, but it takes some time to do it. So if after you've put in the work, which is probably the work of years and years, you may find that it's pretty difficult to arrive at a different conclusion, as long as we're arriving with a posture of openness and prayerful reflection. But that can take some time, and that's okay. But do wrestle with it. It's important to me that you ask those questions, because asking those questions and being curious, compassionate, and courageous is a profound way of living our discipleship today and a necessary aspect of being a part of the family of God. Let's pray to end our session. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.